I never thought buying a lake would come with a side of drama, but here I was, standing on my brand new dock, feeling like I had won the lottery of peace and quiet. The sun was just peeking over the trees, painting the water gold, and for a few fleeting moments it was perfect. I had always dreamed of owning a little slice of serenity, somewhere I could escape the chaos of city life, toss a fishing line, and forget about bills and emails. I imagined lazy afternoons on the water, mornings with a cup of coffee watching ducks glide by, and evenings that ended with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees. Simple, peaceful mine. Or so I thought. A few days after moving in, I noticed something strange. A group of neighbors gathered near the main dock, whispering to each other and pointing at me. That's when I met Karen. Karen was the kind of HOA president who looked like she had stepped straight out of a villain handbook. Perfectly pressed shirt, sharp bob haircut, and a smile that never reached her eyes. She introduced herself as if she was welcoming me to the neighborhood, but every word was laced with a warning. "We're so glad to have new residents," she said. "Just remember, rules are rules around here." I nodded politely, but inside I was already suspicious. What rules? I had bought the lake, didn't I? Or at least the part of it that touched my property. I wasn't sure, and Karen's smile did nothing to calm my nerves. It didn't take long for me to find out. On my first attempt to dock my boat near the shared area, Karen appeared as if by magic, clipboard in hand. She was measuring something, muttering about distances, and glaring like I was about to commit a federal crime. I tried to explain that I had every right to use the water at the edge of my property. She shook her head slowly and said, "Not so fast. There are guidelines. You need approval to access the dock." Approval? I blinked. I had purchased the lake for crying out loud, not a membership to a secret country club. I looked at the clipboard, hoping to find some hint of reason, but all I saw were scribbles and citations to pages in a rulebook that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. The absurdity of the situation hit me, and I tried to laugh it off. "You're telling me I can't use my own dock?" I asked. Karen nodded solemnly. "You may use it, but only under supervision and in accordance with the HOA's standards for seasonal water activity. You'll need a permit for that." I thought she was joking. I really did. But the glint in her eyes told me otherwise. That's when she mentioned the police. "We just want to make sure everyone follows the rules. You wouldn't want an incident now, would you?" I remember staring at her, trying to process that sentence. The cops? Over a dock, on a lake I had bought. My first day of freedom was turning into something out of a comedy horror show, and I was the unwilling star. After that encounter, I spent hours packing, staring at the water, and wondering what I had got myself into. Every time I thought about enjoying a peaceful moment, I imagined Karen lurking somewhere, clipboard in hand, ready to pull out some obscure rule and ruin it. It was absurd, yes, but also oddly thrilling. I realized that I couldn't just sit back and hope for her to disappear. If I wanted to enjoy my lake, I was going to have to fight, but not in some reckless, angry way. I needed strategy. I needed knowledge. I needed to understand property law and exactly where her authority ended. And so I started digging. I spent late nights researching property rights, easements, and water law, trying to figure out exactly what Karen could and could not control. Somewhere between legal websites and forums full of angry homeowners, a plan began to take shape. A plan that would let me enjoy my lake while teaching the HOA a lesson in boundaries, without breaking a single law. I didn't know it yet, but that peaceful morning on the dock was the calm before the storm. Karen didn't know it either, but her clipboard had just met its match. The lake I bought wasn't just a body of water, it was about to become and I intended to win. I thought the first encounter with Karen was bad, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It started on a quiet Saturday morning. I had my coffee, my fishing gear, and that hard-earned optimism that maybe, just maybe, the HOA wouldn't ruin my day. I stepped onto my dock, ready to push my boat into the water when I saw her, Karen, standing at the far end, clipboard in hand, like some lake-themed sentry. "Good morning," she said, smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you've checked your permits." I blinked. Permits? For fishing? For boating? For breathing near the lake? I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say a word, she added, "I called the sheriff's office this morning just to make sure everything is compliant." My heart sank. Compliant. With what exactly? The law, common sense. The HOA rulebook she clearly wrote herself. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, a squad car pulled up. Two officers stepped out, looking a little confused, scanning the scene. Karen waved them over, presenting my fishing license like it was some sort of criminal evidence. I tried to explain calmly that I owned the lakefront property, that I was within my rights to fish and dock my boat, but she cut me off with the kind of authority only an HOA president can summon. "You see," she said, leaning toward the officers, "he thinks he can just use the dock without following the rules. I just want to make sure the law is being observed." The officers exchanged glances, clearly thinking this was some kind of strange joke. "Ma'am," one of them said, "he owns the property. He's within his rights to access the water." Karen's jaw tightened, and I saw that familiar fire in her eyes. She tried to argue, but it was clear the law was on my side. The officers left, shaking their heads politely, and Karen stood there fuming, clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. I wanted to laugh, but instead, I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and tried to focus on the water. That day, though, I realized this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. The HOA had no intention of letting me enjoy my property in peace. Karen and her board members were determined to make life difficult, and I had to prepare for the long game. I spent the afternoon walking the property lines, taking photographs, measuring distances, and jotting notes. Every inch of my lakefront was mine, and I needed to know it like the back of my hand. Late that night, I sat in my study, surrounded by piles of HOA documents, old property deeds, and a laptop full of legal forums. I wasn't just angry, I was intrigued. There was a challenge here, and the more I read, the more I realized that Karen's power was largely imaginary. She thrived on intimidation and obscure rules, but she had no real authority over the land I had purchased. I started imagining the possibilities. I could enjoy my lake, block her petty attempts to control it, and still stay within the law. The idea made me grin. I could practically hear her fuming already, trying to find loopholes that didn't exist. The next morning, I went back to the dock with renewed determination. Karen, predictably, was there, clipboard at the ready. I walked toward her, and without saying a word, began installing small, clearly marked posts along the edge of my property. I wasn't blocking the water completely yet, just marking the boundaries, letting her know that I had plans. Her reaction was priceless. She gasped, muttered something about rules and permissions, and began packing back and forth like a general who had just lost a battle in her mind. I poured myself another cup of coffee and leaned casually against my dock, enjoying the show. Neighbors began to notice. Some came over quietly, curious about what was happening. They whispered about Karen's relentless control over trivial matters and nodded when I explained that this was just the beginning. For the first time, I realized I wasn't entirely alone. People were watching, some silently cheering, and that small sense of support felt like fuel. By the end of the day, I had a plan forming. Karen had made it clear that she would escalate, that she would try everything in her power to stop me. But I had research, preparation, and patience on my side. The lake was mine, the law was mine, and soon, Karen would learn exactly how far property rights could go. As I watched the sun set over the water, I sipped my coffee and smiled to myself. This wasn't just about a dock anymore. It was about standing my ground, proving a point, and reclaiming the peace I had bought. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready. After the confrontation with Karen and her little HOA entourage, I realized one thing. I was dealing with more than just a few grumpy neighbors. This was a full-blown power struggle, and if I wanted to enjoy my lake, I needed more than stubbornness and a morning coffee. I needed knowledge, I needed strategy, and most importantly, I needed to know exactly what my rights were. I spent that night like a detective on a high-stakes case, only instead of fingerprints and alibis, I had property deeds, easement maps, and HOA bylaws. I had stacks of papers spread across my kitchen table, coffee cups precariously balanced between legal tomes, and my laptop glowing with endless forum threads full of people debating the nuances of waterfront property law. I read everything: state statutes, county regulations, old cases where homeowners had successfully defended their rights. Some of it was dry and incomprehensible, but slowly, patterns began to emerge. I discovered something that made my pulse quicken. The area near the dock that Karen was claiming as shared was actually part of my property. Every line, every marker on the deed confirmed it. I owned the land, I owned the water frontage, and legally, no HOA rule could take that away. I could block the dock if I wanted, limit access, and enforce my own rights without fear of repercussion. My mind raced with possibilities, and I had to suppress a laugh at how oblivious Karen had been. She thought she had authority, but in reality, she was standing on the edge of my empire, armed only with a clipboard. I spent hours online arguing with strangers in forums. "No, you cannot tell a homeowner they can't use their dock," I typed furiously. "Yes, the HOA can enforce some rules, but property rights trump control over water access." Some users were helpful, others combative, but the more I read, the more confident I became. I could almost visualize Karen's face if she realized her supposed power was nothing more than ink on paper. By midnight, I had formed a plan. It wasn't aggressive or reckless, it was precise. I would mark the boundaries clearly, post signs, and if necessary, physically block the dock in ways that were legally sound. I wanted to make a point, but I didn't want to give her any reason to involve the law in a way that might complicate things. Every move had to be calculated. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose. I put on a hat to block the sun, grabbed measuring tape, stakes, and a few simple tools, and headed down to the dock. Karen was already there, as if she had sensed my activity. She raised an eyebrow and clutched her clipboard like a shield. I didn't say a word. I simply measured, marked, and installed small posts along the boundary of my property. Each post was subtle, just enough to define my area without being provocative. Karen muttered under her breath, packing back and forth, but I ignored her. I kept working, enjoying the quiet sound of stakes tapping into the earth and the faint lapping of the water against the shore. Neighbors walked by, curious. Some whispered, "Wow, she's really going to try to stop you." Others chuckled at Karen's muttering. I waved, smiled, and kept working. It was strangely satisfying. For once, I felt in control. I wasn't just a victim of an overzealous HOA, I was taking command of my own property, and every step I took reinforced that fact. By the end of the morning, the boundaries were clear. The dock, which Karen had assumed was hers to police, now belonged unmistakably to me. I could see the frustration on her face, a mix of disbelief and anger. She had no clue that her carefully constructed rules had no legal standing here. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. As I packed up my tools, I realized something important. This was bigger than just a dock. It was about asserting control over my own life, over my own space. Karen had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost her patience, time, and maybe even a little dignity. I couldn't wait to see her next move, but one thing was certain: the lake was mine, and I was ready to defend it. The sun was warm on my shoulders, the water sparkled, and for the first time in days I felt a small taste of victory. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Karen would escalate, the board might get involved, and the drama was far from over. I smiled, sipping my coffee because I was ready. I had knowledge, I had strategy, and now I had a plan that no clipboard-wielding HOA president could stop. I woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose. The previous days had been about research, measurements, and planning. Today, it was time for action. I brewed a strong cup of coffee, double-checked my tools, and grabbed the stakes, ropes, and the small, private property signs I had printed the night before. Nothing aggressive, nothing illegal, just clear markers to assert what was mine. As I stepped onto the dock, I saw Karen standing on the other side, clipboard in hand, like she had camped out overnight. She didn't say hello this time. She just stared, her eyes narrowing into laser beams of disapproval. I waved casually. She didn't wave back. That was fine, I wasn't here to make friends. I began setting up the boundary markers, placing each post with care, making sure they were visible but unobtrusive. I measured twice, hammered once, feeling a sense of satisfaction with every tap of the mallet. Karen muttered something about encroaching on shared space, but I ignored her. Every step I took reminded me that I was standing firmly on my property and the law was on my side. A couple of neighbors wandered over, curious about the commotion. I explained calmly, "I'm marking my property so I can use the lake without interference. Nothing fancy, just property rights." They nodded, whispering to each other about Karen's obsession with rules. I could see a few smiles hiding behind curtains from other houses. The support was quiet, but it was there. Karen, of course, had other ideas. She moved closer, waving her clipboard like a sword. "You're not authorized to block access to the dock. You have to follow HOA rules." I paused, wiped sweat from my forehead, and smiled. "I've checked, Karen. Everything I'm doing is within my property rights. You can call the police, hire a lawyer, whatever you want. But this is my land, and I'm marking it clearly." Her jaw tightened, and I could tell she was calculating her next move. It was like watching a storm gathering over the lake, only in slow motion. I enjoyed the tension. I had spent days preparing for this moment, and now, the real challenge had begun. By mid-morning, the boundary markers were complete. The dock was no longer ambiguous. My property, my rules, and my water. Karen paced back and forth, muttering about violations and approvals, while I stood calmly on the dock, sipping my coffee, watching her antics. It was oddly satisfying, like seeing a cat chasing its own tail. Then came the first real test. A member of the HOA board appeared, probably summoned by Karen, walking down the dock like they owned the place. I greeted them politely, explaining that these markers were within my legal rights. They hesitated, glanced at Karen, then at the posts, and finally muttered something about consulting the rules before retreating. Victory, small but significant. The rest of the day passed with minor standoffs and whispered complaints. Karen tried a few tactics, measuring tape in hand, taking pictures, muttering about bylaws, but none of it had any legal weight. I stayed calm, focused on my coffee, my lake, and the satisfaction of seeing boundaries respected for once. By sunset, I leaned back on my dock, the water glowing in the fading light. It was peaceful again, almost like it had been before the HOA storm descended. I knew this wasn't the end, of course. Karen wouldn't give up so easily, and I could already anticipate her next move. Maybe she would call more cops, maybe she would send another letter, maybe she would try to rally neighbors against me. But I had something she didn't: preparation, knowledge, and patience. Every step I took was calculated, every action within the law, and every small victory was mine to savor. Karen might have her clipboard and her endless rules, but I had reality and property rights on my side. As the sky turned deep orange and the lake shimmered with the reflection of the setting sun, I felt a quiet thrill. The real battle had only begun, and I was ready. Karen might have thought she could intimidate me, but she had underestimated one thing: I was not just a homeowner. I was a strategist, and the lake was my territory. That night, I went inside, made a fresh cup of coffee, and started drafting the next stage of my plan. The stakes were higher now, and the HOA had no idea what was coming. The dock that once represented conflict was now a symbol of my resolve, and Karen had no clue that her power over it was about to crumble. I knew the day would come when Karen and the rest of the HOA would test my boundaries. I had spent weeks preparing, marking property lines, researching law, and imagining the showdown, but nothing quite prepared me for the first real confrontation. It happened on a crisp Saturday morning. I had my coffee, my fishing gear, and a quiet optimism that maybe this time, things would go smoothly. Of course, I was wrong. I stepped onto my dock and almost tripped over the sight of Karen, clipboard in hand, standing at the water's edge like a general ready to lead a charge. Behind her, two other HOA board members lingered, whispering and pointing at my carefully placed stakes and signs. I took a deep breath, smiled politely, and tried to appear calm. I knew the key to this was confidence. "Good morning," I said, waving casually. Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't return the greeting. "You've crossed a line," she said, her voice sharp. "You cannot block the dock. It's shared property, and you are violating HOA rules." I raised an eyebrow. Actually, according to the deed and the county records, this dock falls squarely on my property line. I'm simply marking my land. Nothing more, nothing less. Karen's face turned a shade of red I didn't think was possible for a human. She gestured toward the water, muttering about rules, guidelines, and permissions. I sipped my coffee calmly, enjoying the absurdity of it all. Here was a woman trying to wield imaginary power, while I stood firmly within the law. The board members shuffled uncomfortably, and I could see the doubt creeping into their expressions. None of them wanted to escalate further because they knew I had done my homework. The tension was almost cinematic, like a showdown in a small-town courtroom, except with more water and coffee. Then Karen pulled out her trump card. She reached for her phone, clearly planning to call the police again. I raised my hand in a calm gesture. "Go ahead," I said. "I've made sure everything I've done is fully within my property rights. You'll see when the officers arrive." She hesitated, the phone trembling in her hand. I could almost hear her internal panic. What if this time she didn't have the law on her side? What if her precious rules didn't matter at all? By the time the squad car arrived, Karen was practically vibrating with frustration. Two officers stepped out, polite but wary, scanning the dock, the stakes, and me. Karen launched into her well-rehearsed speech about shared property, violations, and the importance of following HOA rules. The officers listened patiently, then glanced at me. "Sir, are these stakes and signs within your property?" one asked. "Yes," I said. "I've checked the county records and the deed. This is my land. I'm simply marking my property." The officers exchanged glances and nodded. Karen's face fell. Her carefully constructed argument collapsed under the weight of facts and legality. One officer even smiled politely and said, "It looks like you're within your rights, ma'am. There's nothing for us to enforce here." Karen fumed silently, muttering under her breath. I tried, and mostly failed, not to laugh. Watching someone so determinedly in control realize they had no authority at all is a rare kind of satisfaction. The board members lingered awkwardly, unsure whether to stay or retreat. Finally, they shuffled off, muttering about consulting the rules and future meetings. Karen lingered a moment longer, glaring daggers at me before storming off, clutching her clipboard like a shield in defeat. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline fade. The lake was calm again, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like mine. I could finally step back, enjoy the water, and watch the sunset without worrying about who might show up to lecture me about rules that didn't exist. As I leaned back on the dock and sipped my coffee, I realized something important. This victory was small but crucial. Karen would regroup, the board might try something else, and the drama wasn't over. But I had made my point clear. I knew my rights, I was prepared, and I wasn't afraid to stand my ground. Neighbors began trickling by, whispering congratulations and subtle nods of approval. I could see the relief on their faces. They had been quietly watching, waiting to see if the new homeowner could withstand the HOA storm. I smiled, tipping my hat to them. By sunset, the lake was peaceful, the stakes and signs firmly in place, and I felt a quiet thrill of triumph. Karen had underestimated me, and now she had proof that property rights matter more than arbitrary rules. That night, I sat by my window sipping coffee, plotting the next phase of my plan. The confrontation had ended in my favor, but I knew Karen would be back. And when she did, I intended to be even more prepared. The battle over the lake was just beginning, and I was ready for whatever absurdity she threw at me next. The morning after the showdown with Karen felt quiet. Too quiet, actually. I knew better than to think the HOA would simply retreat and leave me alone. Karen didn't strike me as the type to accept defeat gracefully. No, she was the kind of person who would regroup, plan, and escalate in ways that tested patience, boundaries, and common sense. Sure enough, by mid-morning, the first salvo arrived. I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope stamped with the HOA logo. Inside was a letter, formal and filled with bureaucratic language, asserting that my property modifications, those simple stakes and signs, were a violation of community guidelines and shared lake access protocols. I read it carefully and then I laughed, out loud. Not the polite chuckle you might expect, but a full, ridiculous, slightly laugh. It was almost impressive, really. Here was Karen, still trying to control a lake she didn't own, wielding rules that had no legal foundation against me. I couldn't help but imagine her packing her living room, muttering about my audacity, clutching her precious clipboard as if it were Excalibur itself. I decided to respond strategically. I drafted a calm, professional letter, citing property records, county regulations, and the precise legal basis for every marker I had placed. I included photos, measurements, and a copy of the relevant deed. I made it clear. I was within my rights, the stakes and signs were lawful, and any attempt to remove them without my consent could result in legal consequences. By the time I sent the letter, I felt a mix of satisfaction and amusement. Karen might have imagined she was in control, but I had turned the tables. The lake wasn't just a body of water anymore, it was a chessboard, and I was thinking several moves ahead. The next day, I saw Karen hovering near the dock again, looking frustrated and flustered. She had brought along 2 other board members, clipboard in hand, probably hoping that numbers would intimidate me. I smiled and waved. One of them muttered something about getting the law involved, but I ignored it. I spent the morning calmly tending to the dock, adjusting a post here, making sure the signage was visible there, all while Karen and her entourage argued amongst themselves. It was almost comedic, the seriousness of their faces, the intensity of their whispers, all directed at stakes and a few small signs. I sipped my coffee and shook my head. This was absurd, yes, but also oddly satisfying. Then came the first real test of patience. Karen approached me directly, trying to guilt-trip, intimidate, and manipulate all at once. "You don't understand," she said, voice dripping with faux authority. "The community expects cooperation, respect for shared spaces, and adherence to the rules. You're being unreasonable." I took a slow sip of coffee and let the silence stretch for just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Then I smiled and said, "I understand perfectly. I've done my homework, I respect the law, and I respect my property. The stakes, signs, and posts are all fully compliant with property regulations. Anything else is, unfortunately, out of my control." She opened her mouth to argue, then paused. I could see the gears turning, trying to find a loophole, a shred of authority, a way to assert control. I could almost hear her internal panic. She had nothing. Legally, logically, practically, she had nothing. By late afternoon, Karen and her board members had retreated, leaving me alone on the dock. The lake sparkled in the sunlight, calm and undisturbed, as if it were acknowledging my small victory. I walked along the edge of my property, taking careful notes of each stake and sign placement, making sure that everything was airtight. This wasn't about revenge, it was about control, boundaries, and peace of mind. That evening, I sat by the window, coffee in hand, reflecting on the events of the day. Karen might escalate again, I knew that. She might try emails, letters, or even more public confrontations. But each time I had a strategy, documentation, and patience on my side. The HOA might have rules, but I had the law, the evidence, and the moral high ground. As the sun set over my lake, painting the water in gold and pink hues, I felt a sense of calm. I had taken control of my property, enforced my rights, and held my ground without losing my temper or breaking a single rule. Karen might have imagined herself powerful, but in reality, she was only highlighting how ridiculous her obsession had become. The lake was mine, my property was secure, and I had learned a valuable lesson. Patience, preparation, and the law are the best allies in a battle against absurd authority. I had a feeling Karen wasn't done. If anything, her defeat only fueled her determination. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes. The HOA board meetings became more dramatic, and neighbors whispered about Karen's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control. Flyers appeared on mailboxes, letters slid under doors, all filled with vague threats and references to shared responsibilities and community standards. I read each one carefully, sipping coffee, suppressing a laugh. The creativity of her bureaucratic fury was impressive, if not entirely effective. Karen was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me over stakes, signs, and a few posts on my own property. She even attempted to hold a small meeting near the lake, hoping to rally support. I watched from my dock, amused, coffee in hand, as she ranted passionately about rules that didn't apply to me. That's when she made her biggest mistake. She decided to call a special HOA inspection, complete with cameras, a surveyor, and a couple of sympathetic board members. They marched down to my dock like an army, determined to enforce their imaginary authority. I greeted them politely, holding my coffee like a shield of calm. "Good morning," I said, smiling. "How can I help you?" Karen, of course, launched into her prepared speech. "We're here to inspect your modifications to the dock and the shoreline. We need to ensure compliance with the HOA rules. Any violations could result in fines." I took a deep breath and gestured to the stakes and signs. "Everything you see is fully compliant with county records, property deeds, and state law. You're welcome to document it yourselves, but legally, there's nothing to enforce here." The surveyor, a serious-looking man with a clipboard, glanced at my stakes, then at the deed I handed him. He checked the county records on his tablet and muttered something under his breath. I caught the words, "Completely legal. No HOA authority here." Karen's face fell. I could almost see the steam coming out of her ears. She tried to argue, cite obscure clauses, and even waved her clipboard dramatically, but it was clear. Reality and law were against her. The surveyor gently explained that I had every right to mark my property as I saw fit. The board members shuffled awkwardly, realizing that they had been dragged into a confrontation they could not win. Neighbors had gathered silently, watching the spectacle. Some whispered in support, others just shook their heads in disbelief. Karen's grand plan had backfired spectacularly. The HOA had marshaled its forces, called in witnesses, and prepared for a showdown, only to have every move invalidated by a simple truth. I own my land, and I was exercising my legal rights. Karen finally turned and stormed off, muttering about appeals, attorneys, and future actions. The board members followed, trying to placate her, but it was too late. Their authority had crumbled, and my lake was peaceful once again. I stood on the dock, taking a deep breath, and let the adrenaline fade. I couldn't help but smile. It was almost surreal. Weeks of tension, confrontation, and meticulous preparation had led to this moment. The stakes were secure, the signs were in place, and the HOA had been humiliated in front of the neighborhood. I poured myself another cup of coffee and leaned back, watching the sun glint off the water. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that I had handled everything calmly, legally, and with a touch of humor. I realized then that this wasn't just about a dock, a lake, or a property dispute. It was about standing up to unreasonable authority, asserting boundaries, and protecting something I cared deeply about. Karen's obsession with control had blinded her to the reality of the situation. She had tried every trick, every intimidation tactic, every rule in her arsenal, and none of it worked. Neighbors began drifting back to their homes, some waving quietly, some just shaking their heads in disbelief at the chaos Karen had created. I watched the lake settle into its natural rhythm, the water reflecting the sky in calm, shimmering patterns. Peace, finally, returned. That night, as I sat by my window with coffee in hand, I reflected on everything that had happened. Karen had been relentless, creative, and dramatic, but preparation, patience, and knowledge had won the day. I knew she might try something again someday, but for now, my lake was mine, and I had the satisfaction of knowing that I had stood firm without compromising my principles or my rights. Sometimes I thought, the biggest victories come not from fighting harder, but from knowing the law, planning carefully, and letting reality do most of the work for you. And in this case, reality and property law had sided with me. The days that followed felt almost surreal. The lake, which had been the center of conflict, was finally quiet. I could hear the gentle lapping of water against the dock, the soft chirping of birds, and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. For the first time since buying the property, I felt the sense of peace I had imagined on that first morning. No HOA board members looming over my shoulder, no Karen muttering about rules, no clipboard-wielding inspections. Just me, my lake, and the quiet satisfaction of victory. I spent my mornings fishing, my afternoons kayaking, and my evenings sitting on the dock with a coffee in hand, reflecting on the chaos that had become part of my daily life. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, a simple act of enjoying my property had turned into a full-blown battle of wills with the HOA. Neighbors occasionally waved from across the water, some offering quiet congratulations, others shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. I realized that, in a strange way, this ordeal had brought the community together, or at least made them silently cheer for the underdog. I couldn't help but smile thinking about how Karen's obsession with control had inadvertently made me something of a local legend. Of course, Karen didn't disappear entirely. I saw her from a distance, packing near her house, muttering about bylaws, legal loopholes, and some future plan she was hatching. But it was clear that her power had been diminished. She could no longer intimidate, control, or disrupt my enjoyment of the lake. Every time she appeared, I reminded myself that preparation and patience had won the day. I took time to reflect on what I had learned through the ordeal. First, knowledge is power. Understanding property law, easements, and your rights isn't just for lawyers. It's essential if you want to protect your home and your sanity. Second, patience is more effective than aggression. Every time Karen tried to push, argue, or intimidate, I responded calmly, legally, and deliberately, letting the absurdity of her actions speak for itself. And third, humor is a secret weapon. Being able to laugh at the situation, even quietly, made the tension bearable and kept me sane. One afternoon, I noticed a small group of kids from the neighborhood quietly fishing from the shoreline near my dock. I walked over, smiled, and invited them to cast their lines a little closer to the water I owned. Their faces lit up, and for a few minutes, we shared the simple joy of the lake, free from HOA rules or absurd restrictions. In that moment, I realized that the lake wasn't just mine, it was a place of community, calm, and freedom. Looking back, I could see how the entire ordeal had changed me. I had learned to assert myself, to research and prepare, and to stand firm without escalating unnecessarily. I had turned what could have been a stressful nightmare into a story I would tell for years, one filled with tension, humor, and eventual triumph. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the lake with shades of orange and gold, I poured myself a final cup of coffee for the day and sat on the dock. The water reflected the sky, shimmering gently. I took a deep breath, letting the calm sink in. Karen's antics, the board meetings, the letters, and the inspections, all of it seemed almost distant now, like a bad dream I had survived. The lake was mine, my property was secure, and I had learned a lesson in patience, preparation, and quiet resilience. I knew Karen might return someday with another scheme, but I also knew I would be ready. No clipboard, no obscure rule, no small-minded intimidation could take away the peace I had fought so carefully to protect. I took a final sip of coffee, smiled at the water, and whispered to myself, "This is exactly why I bought a lake." And in that moment, with the gentle ripples reflecting the last light of day, I felt a quiet satisfaction that no HOA could ever take away. The battle was over, the lake was calm, and my victory, legal, peaceful, and thoroughly satisfying, was complete. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.